Yeah, so starting, hold on. Yeah, 5 seconds.
Hello, I'm Chieh, the President of the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries. Welcome to the first event of the Behavioral Science Series as part of the IFoA's 2021 Thought Leadership Program. This Behavioral Science Series has been generously sponsored by Hong Kong-based IFoA Fellow, Dr. Patrick Poon. Thanks to his kind support, we are able to host the events in the entire series free of charge to members and non-members. At the last count, there were more than 450 people registered into today's webinar. I would like to welcome all of you. I would like to use my opening remarks to give some context to the thinking and inspiration of the IFoA Thought Leadership Program before I introduce today's speaker and panelists. Through our new program of events, which you can see on this slide, we want to bring thought leadership to the foreground of the IFoA once more. This is very much in line with our strategy as we seek to reposition the IFoA as the center of key societal debates, some of which are profoundly actuarial, while others reach out beyond traditional actuarial thought. We aim to cut through the noise, add to the debate, and move the conversation forward, and aim to build the IFoA's reputation as an authority to execute our public interest duties. In my presidential address in June last year, I summarized what I considered to be the main priorities and agenda in my presidential year into 5 pillars, which are shown in the slide here. Last month, we gave special emphasis to the big regulatory and societal issues of our time in the Finance in the Public Interest series, involving prominent public intellectuals like the economists Professor Paul Collier and John Kay, and the chief economist of Bank of England, Andy Haldane, and our own IFoA's thought leaders. In addition to addressing our public interest role, we also aim to bring greater visibility to the thought leaders in our profession, thus bringing the spirit of the learner society to the foreground, as explicated in Pillar 1 of my presidential address. Next week, the actuarial innovation in the COVID-19 era will extend further and more decisively, not only the variety, depth, and dynamism of the profession's thought leadership, but also the response we are able to elicit from thought leaders in government, academia, and the other professions. Today's Behavioral Science series is a sub-series of lectures under the Dr. Patrick Poon Presidential Speakers Series. Unlike the Finance in the Public Interest or the actual innovation in the COVID-19 era, it focuses the profession's attention away from our traditional domains and core skill sets. It seeks to engage and encourage the members of the IFoA in the widening of our skill sets and the diversifying of our mindsets to help bring our vision of a transformed IFoA and profession to life. This Behavioral Science series seeks to discuss the personal qualities necessary to navigate the changes unleashed by the digital revolution, the mindsets and values required to undertake cultural and organizational transformation, the leadership and intellectual frameworks necessary to make progress in the solving of wicked, systemic, and sustainability challenges of our times. In January early this year, Professor Andrew Scott talked to us about the mindsets and tactics we needed to adopt to thrive in an increasingly long life and in the digitally transformed era. On 18th of May later this month, Professor Adrian Smith, President of the Royal Society, will talk about our future in the transformed world of mathematics. On the 4th of June, educational expert and until recently, chair of the IFoA's Life Learning Board, Dr. Helen Wright, will give a lecture on the growth mindset. On the 23rd of June, senior actuaries Andrew Smith, Neil Cantor, and Melinda Strudwick will discuss handling uncertainty beyond risk models. On 28th of June, Dr. Patrick Poon, the sponsor of this thought leadership program, will speak to his vision of the profession, his business and leadership philosophy, and his philanthropic interests. On the same morning, leadership guru David Rook will speak to why we need to move beyond our technical skill sets to thrive in the digital age and the age of uncertainty in the aptly titled lecture, "An actuary who is only an actuary is not an actuary." On the 5th of July, systems and futures thinker, Dr. Anthony Hodgson, will speak to complex problems and second-order thinking. On the 9th of July, Professor Herminia Ibarra of the London Business School will share with us how we ourselves need to adopt unconventional strategies to evolve our working identities in the digital age. And finally, on the 16th of July, past presidents and chair of management board of the IFoA, Ronnie Bowie, Paul Thornton, Jane Curtis, and Sally Bridgeland will gather together to discuss how we coerce our narrative together as we seek to transform the culture of the profession. Today, Professor Keith Grint will shine light on some of the systemic issues and wicked problems which we need to address if we are to shift the dial on governance, sustainability, and other challenges as outlined in the 5 pillars enunciated in my presidential address. Now that I provided you with a context to the inspiration behind this particular series, I'm delighted to say a few words about today's guest speaker, Professor Keith Grint. Keith Grint is Professor Emeritus at Warwick University, where he was Professor of Public Leadership until 2018. He spent 10 years working in various positions across a number of industry sectors before switching to an academic career. Since becoming an academic, Keith has held chairs at Cranfield University and Lancaster University, and he was director of Lancaster Leadership Centre. He spent 12 years at Oxford University and was director of research at Chieh Business School. Keith has published several seminal books on leadership and management, and he's currently working on a book on mutiny. After the lecture, we will be joined by Angela Darlington and Nick Spencer for a more detailed discussion before we move into the question and answer session. I would like to say a few words about the 2 panelists before I hand over to Professor Keith Grint. Angela is the CEO of UK Life Insurance, a position she has held since 24th of April 2019, and I understand she'll be stepping down from this role later this month. Prior to this role, Angela was the Group Chief Risk Officer for Aviva PLC for 4 years. She was also the 2019 Chair of the European Chief Risk Officer Forum. Angela is a well-respected role model for LGBT and women in leadership, featured in the Financial Times Outstanding Leading LGBT and Executive list. Angela is the executive sponsor of Aviva Pride in the UK and actively champions the importance of diversity and inclusion in organizations. Nick Spencer is chair of the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries Sustainability Board and co-chair of the IFoA's Climate-Related Risk Task Force. Nick is a sustainable investment strategist. He founded the Guardian Advice, which helps UK pension funds integrate responsible investment into their investment strategies and portfolios. Nick is a passionate believer on the importance of values and culture and an advocate for aligning the asset management industry with a broader societal purpose. He was co-chair of the Russell Investments EMEA Diversity and Inclusion Committee and is an ambassador for the Diversity Project. Ladies and gentlemen, you can submit a question at any time via the online Q&A function on Zoom, and I would encourage all of you to do so. So with this, I would like to hand over the floor to Keith Grint. Keith.
Thank you very much, and welcome to Wiki Problems and Clumsy Solutions. So let's start with this. I want you to think about the problem which is driving you nuts at work, not the problem that's driving you nuts at home. I don't do domestic problems, I don't do miracles, I just do work problems. So just hold on to you, whatever work problem is proving the most difficult for you to solve at this point in time. So we know from a lot of research about the way to handle change, the way to handle these kinds of problems. A few years ago, a couple of my PhD students, independently of each other, decided to look at all the literature, and they came to this conclusion that most of it says something like this top 10 list, top 10 commandments for change. Need to change, viable alternative, change agents in place, sponsorship from above, realistic scale, integrated transition, symbolic end, plan for resistance, constant advocacy, the locally owned benefits plan. So first of all, this thing makes sense. This kind of list is the intuitively obvious, the kind of things that you should be doing. If you know Kotter is the guru of change management. Kotter has 8 things on his list, and we've got 10. That's a 25% improvement for no extra cost. So we do know how to do these kinds of things. The problem is we don't actually do it properly. For some reason, and for a variety of reasons, something like 3/4 of all change programs fail in their own terms. So when you're asking people, what was it you were trying to achieve, and did you achieve what you were trying to achieve? Most people say, no, we failed, which is bizarre because we do know what to do. So how come we can't make it work? I'm going to suggest one of the big problems is that when you make something work, you kind of develop a universal model of change in your head, and you keep deploying that model, whatever the problem is. And that might be the problem. Actually, there probably isn't a universal model of change. There are different models of change. I'm going to suggest there are 3, but before we go into this, let me just explain this particular slide. This is a heuristic. This is a sense-making activity. It's not reality. I recognize there are more than 1,000 different kinds of problems and hundreds of different kinds of decision styles, but my little head could not cope with numbers beyond 3, so I'm using 3. I'm going to suggest we have critical problems for command, tame problems for management, and wiki problems for leadership. And so the command, management, and leadership issues, these are decision styles. They're not individuals. Let's start with the first one, the land of the commander. First thing to think about is that these have to be portrayed as a self-evident crisis. So people don't believe it's a crisis, then you can't command them in the way that we understand command. Secondly, there is general uncertainty. So the reason that we have a crisis is because most people don't know what to do. You, on the other hand, as the commander, have to know what to do. You have to have the answer in your head, otherwise you're a failed commander. 3, there's no time for discussion or dissent, so we're not worrying here about health and safety nonsense or management procedures. If you don't do what I'm about to tell you, you're going to lose your life or lose your job, or in those kinds of situations. Because of the first 3, you can coerce people. As long as they think there is a crisis, you are the commander with the answer in your head, and you're doing it for the collective good. I'm associating all those with command, and many organizations are run by commanders, not just uniformed organizations. Lots of them are run by commanders, people who are very decisive. They're often decisively wrong, but at least they're decisive. So we have various kinds of crises. We have a financial crisis from 2008. We have the Edgware Road Station London bombing from about 11 years ago. These are the conventional crises that we know about. So a commander's role is to take the required decisive action. That is to provide the answer to the problem. The second category of problems and decision styles are tame problems and management, as I'm defining that. So a tame problem is the equivalent of a puzzle. There's always a solution to a puzzle. That's why it's called a puzzle. And there's always a solution to a tame problem, if it is a tame problem. It can be complicated, but they're not complex. So you can take them out of their context, fix them, put them back into the context. You haven't changed the context. You can't do that with a complex one that we'll look at in a minute. There will be a unilinear solution to each and every tame problem. There will be a standard operating procedure for every tame problem. So Rubik's Cube is a good example of this. It's a puzzle, it's a tame problem, and there is a procedure for fixing it. If you know it, you can fix it quite quickly. If you don't know it, you will fix it, but it will take you some time. So you probably spend something like 3/4 of your professional life addressing tame problems and rolling out standard procedures. This is what you get appointed for. This is what you get promoted for. And if you don't know how to fix the problem in front of you, and it is a tame problem, somebody next to you probably know how to fix it. So heart surgery is a good example of the tame medical problem. It's a very complicated procedure, but the procedure works. So if you're a heart surgeon, this is a tame problem. If you're not a heart surgeon, this is not a tame problem. If I am doing your heart surgery, you don't have a tame problem, you have a critical problem. Launching another new product, tame, do what you did last time. Relocating is a tame domestic problem. This is very stressful, but the more you do it, the easier it becomes. If there's a tick list involved, it's about efficiency, it's almost certainly a tame problem. So management's role is to engage the appropriate process to solve the tame problem. There's a tendency to come back to this all the time, but as you proceed up the managerial hierarchy, you should be doing less of this and more of this. These are wicked problems. These are problems for leadership, as I'm defining leadership. Wicked problems don't have simple solutions, and sometimes they don't have any solutions. They're novel or recalcitrant. They're novel, they're new to you, so you can't know what to do. Which also implies it might not be new to somebody else in the room. They may have been here before, so for them it might be a tame problem. Swap places. But if nobody knows what to do, it might be a wicked problem. Or it's recalcitrant. Had this problem over and over again, and for some reason you can't fix it. So these are complex rather than complicated. You can't solve them in isolation. When you try to, you very often generate other kinds of problems. So climate change is a good example of a contemporary wicked problem. And the first generation of biofuels was an attempt to tame this problem. But what that did is take 25% of American agricultural land out of food production, led to food price increases, food shortages, without fixing climate change. This is typical. When you try and tame wicked problems, you very often generate other problems downstream that you weren't even thinking about when you began the taming process. I don't have stopping rules and therefore no definition of success, so crime will always be with us. I don't know any society which is large scale or long lived that doesn't have crime. So if your target is zero crime, you're wasting everybody's time. You can make crime better and you can make it worse, but you don't seem to be able to fix it. It seems to be part of the human condition. So the trick is to work out how you can manage it better rather than how you can pretend to fix it. Sometimes a solution precedes the problem analysis. This sounds a bit strange. I've got 3 grown-up children. When they were growing up, we had a big problem once. I can remember saying to them, listen up, kids, this is the solution to this problem. And one of my children said, that isn't the problem. But it wasn't until I put the solution on the table that I worked out what the problem is. So sometimes you have to work with a partial solution until you try to work out what the problem actually is. These might be intransigent, therefore, you just have to live with these kinds of things. They're symptoms of deep divisions, contradictory certitudes. People are absolutely certain in completely different directions about what to do about every wicked problem. That's part of the definition. Tend not to have right and wrong solutions, just better or worse developments. And this is the land of uncertainty and ambiguity. So we tend to reward people who are good at removing uncertainty and ambiguity. But I'm going to suggest you can't know what to do with the wicked problem, because if you know what to do, it isn't a wicked problem. Your job, therefore, is to get used to the uncertainty and learn to live with the ambiguity. This is what Keats the poet called negative capability. This is the ability not to make a decision, stand back and to reflect on this. How long have I got before I need to make a decision? You might have 10 seconds, 10 minutes, 10 weeks, 10 years. You should take all of this time. If you get this decision wrong, we're all screwed forever. Let's stop being so decisive all the time. This is the land of positive capability. That would be the land of the commander, when you do need to be decisive, and you need to be decisive now. You need to be able to do both. So as Towell says, these are problems where there are probably no solutions, there are just trade-offs. They're problems for leadership, not management. There's no known processes to these kinds of problems, and there's no point in you acting like a commander and pretending you know the answer, because you can't know the answer. Since you don't know the answer, your job is to ask the right kinds of questions. But we tend to reward people who are good with answers, not questions. Your job is also to engage in high levels of collaboration, because somebody in the room might know, and if they don't, collectively, we might be able to make some progress with this. And because we don't know what to do, this is the land replete with failure. And this is the biggest issue, I think, for many organizations, is how they cope with failure and error and mistakes. If they punish them, then you can make no progress with the wicked problem, because you have to be able to learn from failure, not just punish it. And we know there's some contemporary work on how people respond to complexity and ambiguity. And it does seem to be that the people that can't cope with that are somehow linked to dogmatism and political extremism. So here's an example of the comparison between tame and wicked problems to think about. These are high jump records across time. And 1900 and 1996, the measures in inches. So between 1920 and 1952, the most popular technique is the Western roll. And you don't seem to be able to get beyond 80 inches using this technique. So if it's 1953 and you're thinking about winning the Olympic gold medal for the 1956 Olympics, it doesn't actually matter how efficiently you train at the Western roll. If you want to win the medal, stop doing the Western roll. Doesn't matter how good you are at visualizing the medal. If you want to win it, stop doing the Western roll. So many of us have been struggling with Western roll problems over the last few years. How do you get more out of less? There comes a point in time when you can't get more out of less. You have to get different out of less. Furthermore, there's no point in you being efficient at the wrong task. So the Western roll problem is a tame problem of efficiency, and it's the wrong problem. And the switch from the Western roll to the straddle, that is a wicked problem. So coronavirus is another good example of a contemporary wicked problem. And one of the interesting things about coronavirus is it's probably not just a wicked problem, it's probably a combination of tame, wicked, and critical, which means the tame bit is really about rolling out, for example, the vaccine program. The critical bit is commanding people to stay at home and not do things. And the wicked bit is trying to accept that we're not quite sure what we're about to do. So let's just be careful about this, which means the program ought to be really reversible and in small steps so that you can say, no, that isn't working either, let's go somewhere else. And one of the issues is that the switch in decision styles between tame and wicked and critical looks like it's inconsistency unless you have a common language. So unless you talk to people about, well, this is a wicked problem and that's why we're not quite sure what we're doing, it looks like you have no idea what you're doing and therefore you should not be in charge. This is the point. Unless people have a common language, then you can't switch decision styles. There's also an issue about individual and professional preferences built into this system. So some people like to operate on the basis of the world is just full of tame problems and nothing else. You have to know the answer, otherwise you're a failure. Some people think the world is full of wicked problems for which you always need collaboration. And some people think the world is full of crises for which you should always tell people what to do. I'm suggesting actually the world is full of all kinds of different problems and you need to be able to switch decision styles. But for that to work, you need to have a common language. So how do you address these wicked problems? Well, I think we should start by thinking about a unicorn and a rhino. A unicorn is a beautiful beast, but it's a fable. It doesn't actually exist. It's just a utopian notion. And many of our solutions to many of the problems that we have end up in the fable land, the unicorn land, about world-beating track and trace, for example. This is just a unicorn because we don't have a world-beating track and trace. And maybe we should stop bothering about unicorns and start thinking about what actually does work in the world. And they're probably more like rhinos than unicorns. You know, they're a bit cumbersome. They're not very quick, but they do actually make some progress and they do survive. So I want to think about leadership as a wheelwright, as a way of capturing this. It comes from a story about the Chinese Emperor Liao Bang in the 3rd century BCE, who held consolidated China and then had a banquet to celebrate that. And to the banquet came lots of guests. One of them couldn't understand why he was the emperor, because he wasn't a noble, nor did he appear to be an expert in anything. So he asked Chen Sen, the military expert, why is this man the emperor? And Chen said, well, what determines the strength of a wheel? And the guest said, the strength of the spokes. And Chen responded, 2 sets of spokes of identical strength did not necessarily make wheels of identical strength. The strength is also affected by the spaces between the spokes. And determining the spaces is the true art of the wheelwright. In other words, you don't actually need to be an expert to be successful facing wicked problems. All you have to do is surround yourselves with people who are experts and give them some space to work. All right, let's just summarize where we've got to in terms of this other heuristic: command, management, and leadership, and these 3 criteria. I'm suggesting command is normally about tactical space, management, operational space, and leadership, strategic space, the time you've got for a decision. Command is normally short-term, management, medium-term, leadership, long-term. And the kind of problem you're looking at. I'm suggesting command is normally for critical problems, management for tame problems, and leadership is for wicked problems. The command is just do it. I don't actually care what you think about this, do it. Management, déjà vu, you've been here before many times, you know what to do, roll the process out, it will be fine. Leadership, vu jadé, you've never been here before, if you have, you've never been able to fix it. You need a collective view what to do about this. So the man at the bottom of this, Etzioni, in his work on compliance, argued there are probably 3 reasons why people would want to follow you, which fits quite nicely with this typology. He talked about coercive institutions and coercive compliance. He was working in a prison at the time and argued if you work in a prison, you can normally force people to follow you. I'm suggesting you can force them to follow you if they think there's a crisis. You are the commander with the answer in your head, and you're doing it for the collective good. Most of us live in the central box, what he called calculative compliance. People will follow you there not because you're forcing them, but because it's their job to follow you. It's therefore rational for them to comply, fits with tame problems and the role of management. And occasionally he talks about normative compliance. People will follow you there not because you're forcing them, not because it's their job to follow you, but because they want to. This is the most difficult one to do, which is why it's restricted to wicked problems and the role of leadership as I'm defining that. So we end up here, you're the decision maker inside here. The further you got the vertical axis, the more uncertain you are about what to do about the problem. And the further you go along the horizontal axis, the more collaboration you require. So when you're facing a critical problem, act as a commander, provide the answer. You get access to coercion or physical power. This is what Joseph Nye calls hard power if you know Nye's work. Most of us live in the tame box most of the time, facing act as a manager, organize a process, you get access to calculative or rational compliance. And occasionally you get a wicked problem for which you can't know what to do. Your job, therefore, is to act as a leader, as I've defined that, ask appropriate questions, and engage in high levels of normative or emotional collaboration, what Nye calls soft power. So why don't elegant solutions resolve wicked problems? Why do we have such a problem trying to get this stuff sorted out? So I just want to use some work by Mary Douglas, the anthropologist, who argued on the basis of the two criteria you can see here, grid and group, you can construct cultural archetypes. And this is the reason why we can't fix wicked problems very easily. So grid is how important are the rules and roles in your organization, and group, how important is the group. So you can have high and low in both. I mean, you get high grid, high group, you get a hierarchy, which is based around power and rules and the enforcement of rules. When you get low grid, high group, you get egalitarians. Egalitarians are based on solidarity, not really about rules, much more to do with the group. Individuals don't care about the rules, and they don't care about the roles. There's no individual differentiation here because they're all individuals. And there is no such thing as society. There's just the individual. This is the land of entrepreneurs. Fatalists, high grid, low group, fatalists have given up. They think the grid's against them and there's no group to save them. So Douglas's argument is across time, these cultures become elegant. And by elegant, she means internally coherent philosophical explanations of the way the world works. So they're sense-making cultures. And I'm going to suggest, I'm not going to talk about fatalism today, I'm going to suggest the other three elegant models of culture, hierarchists, egalitarians, and individualists, are useful for addressing tame problems and critical problems, but not useful for addressing wicked problems. So there's something in the culture which allows you to do what you normally do all day long perfectly well, but inhibits you from addressing these wicked problems. Let's start with that. I'll go very briefly through this. Start with individualists and think about why it is that the individualist culture inhibits you from addressing wicked problems. So I spent 12 years teaching in Oxford. When I had my undergraduate tutors, I give the topic to the students a week in advance. They spend a week writing the essay, then they'd come to my office and we would spend 90 minutes debating whatever the topic was. I thought I was doing two things in those days, improving their ability to write and improving their ability to articulate a logical argument in public. This is a really important work-based skill because work runs on the basis of publicly articulated logic. We're not doing that anymore. We're going in this direction, that kind of logic. These are the reasons we're doing that. I'm going to suggest that actually I might have wasted 12 years of my life in Oxford doing that. And the photograph at the top in the middle is probably an explanation for this. And here's the question to think about this. When was the last time anybody listening to this won a logical argument at home with their domestic partner? And usually the answer is not very many. So there's an intriguing question here about how come we think logic works at work all the time, but it fails to work at home. So either we've got into the wrong domestic relationships at home, and this is the universal problem, or logic doesn't work at work in the way you think it works. People will comply with you, not because you're logical, but because you're the boss. Okay, skip on to the hierarchies. So I'm going to, having argued that the individualists are not that logical, that's part of the problem. What about hierarchies? Well, hierarchies basically argue there are two ways to make people do things, and neither of them to do with logic or rationality. They're both to do with power or rules. So the rules one is based on the assumption that if we get the rules right, we'll know what to do. I'm just going to read you some rules from 1941. These are rules from a railway workshop safety rule book. This is issued by the British Railway Authorities in 1941, the beginning of the war. If you found at work without this rule book in your possession, you could be disciplined, you could be sent home. So important is this for the removal of discretion, because it's discretion that destroys hierarchies. You have people making things up as they go along. So what we want is rules to stop them using their initiative. This is rule 5, throwing missiles. Serious injuries may result from the throwing of missiles, such as coal and stone, and you are warned against such a practice. So until Rule 5 comes along in 1941, many British railway workers spent the early years of the war throwing stones at each other. So there's something in rules I want you to worry about. The assumption normally with the rules is that they stop initiative, they inhibit some level of initiative that you don't want. I actually think a lot of rules are about protecting management's backsides. They're not about removing initiative. The second thing that hierarchies say is actually not to do with rules, it's to do with the way that power works. So you can think about power as a domino run. So power is moved when the finger touches the first domino, and the rest are just transmitters, which is why we have hierarchies like this triangle in the middle. When the boss in the top triangle says jump, second in command jumps, and so on down the line. So that reproduces the way that power works in a domino run. We talk about that in terms of power as a possession. Then we talk about powerful chief executives. That's the word we use, powerful, full of power. I wonder whether that's actually true. I wonder whether actually power does lie in hierarchy. And you might relate that to all kinds of things. One thing would be mutinies that I've just finished my book on. A mutiny occurs in the most coercive organization we know of, which is the military at war, when the people at the bottom of the pyramid say, we're not going to fight your stupid war anymore. Now, you can't explain how a mutiny occurs in the most coercive organization we know of, unless it isn't the most coercive organization we know of, because the hierarchy doesn't possess the power. The power is dependent upon subordinates complying. If they refuse to comply and take the consequences of non-compliance, then you can't do anything with them. I mean, the equivalent in domestic things to think about, in theory, those of you who've got children will know you're in complete control of them from day 1 until day 18. You have legal and physical control. They do exactly what this is a picture of my children. They're all saluting me. This is completely fabricated. I've never been able to control any of my children, and despite the fact that I'm supposed to be in charge of them. So there's something in a familial power hierarchy which explains why organizational hierarchies don't work either like that, because power is not based on the possession. Power is a consequence of compliance. If people choose to comply with you, then you have power over them. If they don't, then you don't. What about egalitarians? What do they say? Well, they say what we want is not power over people, but solidarity. If we had more group hugs, we could probably save the entire world. I worry about groups. This is an experiment called the bystander experiment from 1968. There are 2 rooms next to each other. In one room, there's somebody apparently having an epileptic fit. In the next room, these are 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 people. And the question is, who goes to help the person having the epileptic fit? And the answer is, it depends upon the numbers of people in the room. If it's just 1 person, they go to help. If it's 2, they might. If it's 3, they probably won't. If it's 4, they almost certainly won't. And if it's 5, they never do. So there's something in here about groups, the way that groups work. What groups do is displace and disperse responsibility. If you want something doing, don't give it to a group. This is a real problem for egalitarians when they're facing wicked problems. So what egalitarians often do is spend a lot of time in meetings. This is American and UK data. Suggests on average, you spend about 1/3 of our lives in meetings, and about half of that is wasted. I want you to worry about the amount of times we spend in meetings, not because we don't need meetings, but meetings also act as a mechanism for us to be enabled to translate a tame problem into a wicked problem. If I've got a tame problem, what I should be doing is taking personal responsibility for it and executing it. But I don't want to be doing that. I want to tell you a lot about what I'm about to do about my tame problem. And then when I've told you, if you don't stop me and it subsequently goes wrong, it's partly your fault because I told you about this. In other words, what I'm doing is I'm translating a tame problem into a wicked problem, making it a group responsibility so that I don't do anything that makes me responsible for it. So how do you address wicked problems? I want to get you to think about this notion of clumsy solutions. What do I mean by clumsy solutions? Well, elegant means you fit within your normal cultural boundaries, but clumsy means you have to get across the cultural boundaries. So hierarchies, for example, have got great ways for resolving internal conflict, but if they don't have egalitarians on the board, they can become very corrupt. And if they don't have individualists on board, they're not very creative. Egalitarians, on the other hand, are great for looking at a consensus, but they can't make decisions. So they need hierarchies to help maker decisions, and they also need individualists to stop them from attacking individuals. And individualists are great at innovating, but actually they depend upon the market system, which is rooted in both hierarchists and egalitarians. In other words, none of these cultures on their own is able to make anything work. You need the other kinds of cultures to make something work. In other words, you need a clumsy solution space in the middle, situated between the hierarchists, individualists, and egalitarians. So here's a way of thinking about climate change. So for an elegant approach, for fatalists, there's nothing you can do about climate change. For hierarchists, yes, there is. You want to enforce carbon emission rules. This is what Kyoto was about all those years ago. For egalitarians, it's about solidarity. It's not about politicians. It's not about Kyoto. It's about how we live. We need to rethink the way that we live in our communities. Individualists, much more innovative. We could probably innovate our way out of this. So none of these three approaches, none of these three elegant approaches is probably good enough to be able to address climate change, because they're all elegant, they're internally coherent. A clumsy one would say, well, we do need the hierarchists on board, and we also need the egalitarians on board, and we also need the individualists on board. So the clumsy word here is and. The elegant word is or, and the clumsy word is and. So what kinds of people would help us with these kinds of problems? Bricoleurs is a French word, means do it yourself in English is the nearest translation. Bricoleurs are people who are going to try things out. They're experimental, they're pragmatists. They'll do whatever's in front of them and try and fix something. Now, this is not about getting an architect to design a perfect building. This is about finding a piece of wood and seeing if it will do what it needs to do. Because clumsy, wicked problems don't necessarily have perfect answers. And you might be going in the wrong direction. So you need to be really careful and slow about how you address a wicked problem. So the last bit I'm going to think really quickly is about what kinds of techniques might we combine here. So what you've got listed here are the techniques that you would normally associate with these three elegant cultures. Just start with the individualists. So individuals are great at asking questions. And if you don't ask questions, you have a big problem. So this is Hurricane Katrina. And what we know about Hurricane Katrina is that Mr. Bush was briefed by his experts for half an hour before he went on national TV. And Max Mayfield warned him that the levees probably wouldn't hold. And Michael Brown warned him that the dome roof of the wouldn't hold, but he didn't ask any questions. And the consequence of him not asking any questions and them not asking him any questions is that he went on TV and said, I want to assure folks at home we're fully prepared. And he wasn't, because he didn't ask any questions. What he should be asking, Max Mayfield, for example, is, so what will happen if the levees are topped, and where will the water go, and where do the people live, and how do we move them, and how many people are we talking about? It's just questions. Because he doesn't ask any questions, he assumes it's a tone problem, and it isn't. What about egalitarians? What do they think? Well, egalitarians are really all about a collective approach to problems, not individual geniuses. So IKEA, they approached Future Search, a whole systems approach in 2003, and said, can you help us change the way we do everything because the business model is broken? And the group said, well, we're a whole systems approach. You have to get the whole system in the room, and we haven't got a room big enough to get the whole of IKEA in. And if we did, and we got it wrong, there wouldn't be an IKEA left. That's too dangerous. Let's just take one thing, let's just take this sofa, and we'll see if we can get the whole system in the room for the sofa, and we'll see if we can make that work. So they took 52 stakeholders. We spent 18 hours in a room, people who were sourcing the timber, designing the sofa, making it, marketing it, managing it, the chief exec. They went to a hotel and they came out 18 hours later and redesigned the way the whole system was made. So what they'd done is that they'd managed to work out that actually for these kinds of wicked problems, you need to have some kind of vertical slice. You don't want the top, you don't want the horizontal slice at the top to make the decisions. You want a vertical slice through the organization, because the problems and the solutions look different from different levels of the organization. Last one. I'll just do this one about permission giving, the importance of permission giving, why bosses are still important to wicked problems. So this is Jeremy Vine, who was on a tube train in London in 2007, minding his own business, sitting by a woman who's minding her own business. He got to a tube station. The man got on with some behavioral problems, went up to the woman sitting next to Vine, and danced right up against her legs and said weird things to her. He's not assaulting her. It's just weird and embarrassing. Get to the next station, doors open, dancing man left the train. And then somebody else in the train got up and said, why is the world full of crazy people? And goes to the door and banged on the window at the man who was now dancing on the platform outside. When the man on the outside looked up, the man on the inside put his finger up to him And then the doors opened again, and the man came in and beat the man on the inside up, and nobody moved to help him, including Vine, who said, I sat and watched him get beaten up, but I couldn't move. And he couldn't sleep that night. But he promised himself, if it ever happens again, he'll do something. So 2 weeks later, on a bus in London, a different strange man with problems got on the bus, began to abuse the bus driver, and Vine recalled the promise he'd made to himself, forced himself from his seat, went up to the man and said, how dare you do this? This is a public servant. Get off the bus. Go on, get off. And as soon as he said that, everybody else on the bus joined in. Go on, get off. And an old lady came along and whacked him with a handbag, and he got off the bus. And Vine realized what he'd done. He had given them permission to do something different. And we know that most people don't do anything until somebody gives them permission to do something different. Last thing, the extraordinarization of the mundane. This is a phrase used by Elberson and Sveningsson, and their argument is this phrase captures the difference between more and less successful leadership. So here's a scenario: new boss comes in, goes up to the receptionist, said, morning, Mary, isn't it? And Mary says, yes, it is. Who are you? And the new boss says, I'm Jean. Oh, nice to meet you, boss. Nice to meet you, Mary. If I'm not wrong, I think you have a couple of children. I think one of them was ill last week. I hope she's all right. And Mary says, yeah, she's fine. Thank you very much for asking, but she's out of hospital and she's absolutely fine. And Jean, the boss, says, that's great news, Mary. I've got a dash now, but I'll catch you later. Gone. That's it. That's 10 seconds. Now, to Jean, that's just mundane. She's just asking Mary how her children are. It's not a big deal. To Mary, that is extraordinary. That is the first time in her knowledge a new boss has known something about it in advance of meeting her. Never mind, cared about her kids. What an extraordinary boss. And that is the basis for the beginnings of a relationship. And their argument is that relationships are what drives organizations, and they are built on mundane activities. They're not built on great charismatic leaders. They're built upon mundane activities through which you build up the relationships. Okay, so how do we acquire these skills? I'll just briefly respond to Aristotle's argument about ethics. His argument is that you need three things to be successful in life. You need a theoretical knowledge, episteme. You need to have some kind of replicable skills. You need techne. But the most important thing is you need practical wisdom. You need phronesis, a reflective practice. You need to be able to reflect on the things that you do, whether they worked or they didn't work. And his argument is we don't get very many wise young people because they've not had the experience. And we also get a lot of unwise old people. They've had all the experience, but no reflection. You have to be able to reflect on what you've just done to work out what is in the common good and use that as the basis for your decision making. I'll leave you with this. Some problems are so complex, you have to be highly intelligent and well informed just to be undecided about them. If you are not confused by your work, you have not understood it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Keith, for such a wide-ranging discussion, yet succinct on such a wide range of intellectual topics. Yeah, but of course, when we double-click into it, there are many rich material. So I'm going to unpack it a bit, and I would encourage audience to start asking their questions. And I'm going to start a conversation with Angela and Nick, and of course Keith, right? And I want to tie it to a remark which Angela made recently, and she said something about leading people is a wicked problem. But we'll come back to that in a moment's time, yeah. And I want to connect it to your IKEA example. So Keith, from a very actuarial approach, which is sort of quite analytical, you gave us a few things, definitions of tame, complicated, and wicked. We understand that, but it looks like wicked problems always involve people, right? Because going to the moon is a complicated problem. It's a very complicated problem. Building a switch, a tourbillon is a very complicated problem, but it's not a wicked problem. But organizing groups to solve problems involving people can be wicked. So that goes to Annette's point. But then you took us to a space of archetypes, right? Which again is not a big surprise in itself, because we know about personality types, Belbin, Enneagram. All our types bring different organizing principles, whether it's power, equality, or individualism, like the plant in a Belbin will have their own type. But the central issue, okay, then you took us to a place which is almost a motherhood, like to say that relationships is important in leadership. Of course it is important, we studied that. But I want to go much deeper into that. And then eventually you took us to phronesis, techne, episteme, and phronesis, which is about the use of judgment, right? Because if we go to Angela's assertion, and I'm going to ask Angela to kick off, and also the IKEA's problem, right? The IKEA problem is not the solutioning of that 2 days, which is the issue, is the ability to create the process. The ability to create a process to bring the stakeholders, 52 stakeholders, was it, to a 2-day workshop with a shared purpose, with a shared narrative, and with a shared approach. Yeah, which actually is a big problem, yeah, with the shared, because most people, but IKEA has an organizational framework. But many of the wicked problems we see in society, whether it's climate risk or regulation, don't have an organizational framework with boundaries, right? So I want, I know Angela is very experienced in things on wicked, on climate risk and sustainability. I know her interest, but of course she's also a corporate leader. So I wonder whether you could speak to that space. What is so special about wicked problem, except that it's more complex? And maybe tell us about why you said that leading people is a very good example of wicked problem. Maybe you could expand to that with that, Angela.
Yeah, sure. And thanks, Keith, for that lecture. I always I think I've learned over the years to go to actually be prepared to think, oh my God, I've been doing something wrong for a period of time. Whenever I sort of come and listen to someone who talked really interestingly about psychology or people or change or the ways that things work, because I think we will all look back on what we've done and find some successes and some areas where we could have done better. And I think it's really interesting. I love this framework of wicked problems, to give yourself permission to have not got it perfect or right, or in fact there is no perfect or right answer. And I went from an actuarial career into a leadership career, and it's very interesting. Keith's puzzles versus problems. That was something that I started sort of investigating about 10 or 15 years ago, and starting realizing that the human question, why do people do what they do, was as interesting as the mathematical questions that I'd been doing in my career up until that day, but actually also an order of magnitude more difficult. And I think Keith's great for giving us a framework for that, to say actually that's because these are wicked problems, and many of the things that actuaries look at are actually wicked problems, right? Managing pension costs in an aging population, managing, understanding why people don't take out protection. They're all wicked questions that involve people. But I think leadership, in particular, culture change aspect of leadership is a very big wicked problem, and one that I've been sort of fascinated in for the last little while. And I think that's because we do have this tendency to think that there are solutions to all of these things. There's a handbook for change, and in order to change culture, and our regulators and our boards are really, really focused on the culture in our organisation, because it seemed to be one of the challenges from the banking crisis. So can you measure your culture? Can you create an MI scorecard for your culture? And then how do you change it? And how do you change it is normally create a burning fire or a vision for the future of something different. But actually, the wickedness of this problem is that individuals find it really hard to change, and no individual is sitting as an island. They're in a complex system of interactions. And the best example I ever had was the problem, and it's a tiny problem, so it's not climate change, it's not funding pensions. Why do we all have too many emails and too many meetings? And wouldn't it be a better place if that changed? And there's both a vision for a better future in that, a life with fewer emails and more time to think. And there's a burning platform because people are tired and they're spending too much time at work. But we haven't been able to solve it. And why haven't we been able to solve it? It's a really, really interesting question. I think we haven't been able to solve it because we've tried to use tame solutions. So I'm going to put everything that's a CC into a CC mailbox so I don't have a look at them. But actually what everybody does at the end of the day is go to their CC mailbox and find out what they've missed. So they still read the emails. And then you talk to people about why they do that. Well, because I might miss something. Well, what could happen if you miss something? Well, my knowledge that's better than somebody else's won't be applied to that problem. Well, actually, it's probably a problem of trust, or a problem of the system, or there's too much work. You start unpicking layers and layers and layers of systemic issues, knock-on issues, human issues. And that's at the really, really micro level of why do we have too many emails? And then you sort of look at the macro level of as a CEO, what is the culture of the organization that I'm creating? How can I measure it? How can I persuade my board it's positive? How can we change it? Those are truly wicked problems. They are systemic questions. And I think the art of the leader is to start to recognize that. I'm a big fan of Goodhart's law. As soon as something is, as you start to measure something, it tends to stop being a good measure. The observed changes, you influence those things. To recognize that you're on a journey, to stay open to learning, to keep trying and experimenting and changing, but recognizing that you'll never solve that particular problem. If you get rid of meetings, they come back. So you have to keep going at it and changing things. So I mean, there's a we could talk all day about just that particular topic, but I think the problem we've always had is these are wicked problems.
Okay, that's great. I want Keith to help me for my own understanding, because there is a distinction to be made between difficult people problems, because people are mysterious, messy, makers of meanings and all that. Difficult people problems which have been sorted out elsewhere, right? The email problem have been sorted out in Apple and in Amazon, right? They don't have a PowerPoint or email problem, but they got other problems. Yeah. But okay. So leadership. So that I want Keith to help us to make the delineation. I can understand if you tell me world hunger is a wicked problem because it has not been solved. I can understand climate change is a problem because that's not been solved. But the kind of, if it's a people problem, it's a challenging problem, but it has been solved in other organizations. Because sometimes I wonder, some of our governance challenges in IFoA, is that a wicked problem or is it a complicated problem, right? So I wanted Keith to give us some help in the delineation. I'm not underestimating the importance of culture. John Cotter, which you quoted early on, would have recognized the importance of culture and shared purpose in the solving of a lot of his change management program. But Keith, you're making a distinction between those type of problems and wicked problems. Could you share with us your thinking?
I think perhaps the first thing to think about is whether there are large-scale organizations that have fixed either people problems or just other kinds of problems. And we know that most organizations don't last longer than a lifetime, and it's really unusual to last a lifetime. So there's a contrary argument that if you fix a problem, it's quite possibly only temporary. It's not a permanent fix. The second point about this is the distancing mechanism. I think over time, we've often had organizations in the 60s and 70s and 80s that are heralded as the great organizations to work for, until somebody who works for the organization then publishes something which says, actually, it's nothing like that. This is all propaganda. It's actually like this, which is just the same as the organization that I work for. So I mean, if you take Amazon, for example, they've just gone through this attempt in the US, a referendum about whether they want to have a trade union in Amazon. And that's failed. But the fact that they've had a referendum about whether they should have a union to represent them implies that they haven't fixed the problems. So I think quite often we get an external view of organizations, which appears some cases like a unicorn. And actually, we know that organizations are actually stuffed. I've never worked in an organization that isn't stuffed with problems. And we just, we get them going and we keep going and we make a bit of progress. But actually, there is always a problem there. And I don't think these things go away. I think we do, A, we manage them better, and B, we get somebody who's good at communications. So it looks to the outside world that we've actually solved the problem, and that means the share price goes up. But actually, the people that work in the organization are still facing the same kinds of problems that they faced before. One of the reasons I worked for 10 years in industry, and one of the reasons I got out is because it was full of crazy people. And then I went into academia, and I realized it's exactly the same. They're a bit more literate. They might have read a few more books, but they're still crazy. So and then the really worrying conclusion is maybe it's you that's crazy, Keith, and not the entire world. But that can't be true.
Thanks for that, Keith. If you have time, you'll come back to it. But I want to ask Nick to respond to this, but also maybe to add on to some of your own thoughts, because we had a discussion before. And actually, you contended, Nick, you contended, and I'm familiar with your thinking. We have been fellow members of the Actuaries for Transformational Change. You contended that almost all actuarial problems are weaker. And I think you say that, and I think you went further to say that we have lost direction in the last 15 or 20 years because we tend to treat many problems as tame, but actually it's the underlying issues which giving rise to the second order issues which we should pay our attention to. And really you are seeking that compliance to just doing the task should be reversed in order for us to reclaim the purpose of the profession. That is a fairly significant, I of course agree with you, but there's quite a significant assertion. Could you unpack that for the audience?
Yes, certainly. And thanks, Chieh, for the opportunity to be here, and to Keith, which I think is a very interesting lecture and sort of building these ideas together. To build a little on what says, and I work in investments, and I think the core aspect to bring to wicked problems is humility. Is that we don't understand it all, and we've never solved it. You know, all you're doing is not actually only creating a solution, but is to recreate the solution and move forward. And I wonder if that's sometimes the challenge, is maybe that organizations have created at least a solution for that point in time, but the solution continues to evolve. And to Angela's point about Goodhart's law, as soon as you start sort of measuring something, or as soon as you take a part of a wicked problem that's solved, the wickedness kind of creeps around to re-envelop you back into the solution. And I just sort of throw that out as a possible part. But Suee, to your point on the actuarial profession, and that I think actuarial work by its nature is looks at wicked problems. I mean, what we're talking about is understanding uncertainty, and where sort of actuaries are sort of encouraged to develop is that sort of frenetic judgment, that wisdom to understand what lies at the heart of the problem that they're looking to solve, and then come forward with ideas. I mean, for me, it's not about the sort of fact that, we're dealing with problems of the future. It's not actually about our ability to create assumptions to assume away the future, or even to be able to articulate why those assumptions are reasonable. But actually, I think the real part here is for actuaries to understand and articulate what are the gaps in assumptions. Where is it that the assumptions fail and fall apart? If you like, the spaces between the spokes, not the spokes themselves, to use that sort of car word, it just really resonated within that. And so therefore, to think about not just solving the compliance, not just running the calculations, but where are the gaps in the calculations to their ultimate purpose? And one thing that occurs to me is that as a profession, at least for my immediate things, we're unique, or certainly very unusual, in that we focus on problems of the future. Most of the professions, when reflect, focuses on problems either of the present or the past. And actually building up, thinking about that future is fundamentally wicked. To touch your sort of part in the sort of regression, and this is, looking a little from the outside in, have we drifted in the last 20 years? When I started at an actuarial consultancy, sort of nearer 30 years ago, the point there is that each of the partners had a different set of assumptions. You go in sort of there, and they actually have a different set of assumptions. There was no unified for that. And that, as a trainee, always looked a little unusual, until the sort of partner said, well, actually, it's not the assumptions that are important. It's understanding the context of it creates the starting point, but you don't know where that ultimate destination, the purpose, is actually to secure the benefits underlying the pension. But actually the destination, we don't know how to get there. So we're looking far more at a navigation to do it step by step. And I feel that the actual part of the clumsy solution is say, well, we have a torch that kind of peers dimly in the future. We don't know where the end point is. We don't know what the other side of the room is, but we are actually looking to go as far as we can see by the torch, and we'll adapt to the obstacles and to the areas And so we're creating this navigation path into the future. And I think that to me is the core of the actuarial work, the understanding of that in terms of the sort of wickedness of the problems we face. And I think, and what I feel has happened is we've moved a little too much in thinking the calculations are the answer. And I think we must increasingly say the purpose is what we need to look at and actually think about all these gaps and articulate and help navigate us forward. I mean, to borrow from Nico Aspinall, who in the recent series talked about the sort of definition and a particular like, is actuaries are the arbiter of multi-stakeholder problems, using maths to clarify conflicting objectives and getting consensus on a way forward. This, I think, very much fits in Keith's framework of actually combining together the different perspectives, the different worldviews, and actually generating a way forward, but that actually also articulates the contradictions within that.
Okay, we got some really rich and interesting questions coming up. I'm going to ask Angela if she wants to, whether she wants to make some response to Nick. I have some response to do, which I'd like to make, and Keith, whether you want to make a response to Nick before we go to the Q&A proper, or you could wrap it up later in your future answers as well. Angela and Keith, Angela first.
Yeah, well, I also think I tend to agree in that, you know, I work in insurance, so a lot of the actuarial work is driven by regulations and regulators, and Europe was a great fan of writing, you know, endless checklists of things that you need to do, and that can fool you into thinking that the calculation is the destination. Actually, the calculation is the start. It's giving you something which hopefully is decision useful, it gives you, as you say, shines a torch on something at some point in the future and allows you to navigate, because we do need to do that, right? You know, longevity is a really difficult question to price longevity for 30, 40, 50 years. You know, you're making assumptions about politics, the economic, the NHS, obesity trends, alcohol drinking trends, human trends. That's a really, really complex thing. And I think what actuaries are great at doing is taking all that information and bringing it down to a point estimate, because I need to do that to be able to price, to be able to fulfill the valuation requirements. But if we start believing that point estimate is the answer, and a lot of regulation is driving a lot of the activity towards calculating that point estimate. And I as a former CRO, I'm a huge fan of scenario analysis, and actually thinking beyond that and saying, well, what's the range, what are the flaws in this system, not ever believing the model. And I think actuaries are very good at not believing the model and understanding the uncertainty and the problems with that model. But the fact that we're required to produce a point estimate can give other people in the management chain the sense that, well, actually that is the end and that's all they need to do. And so I think actuaries in organisation have a great opportunity to explain uncertainty and help people understand that the valuation is a useful thing, but it's the start, it's not the destination.
Keith, you have any remarks you'd like to make?
Yeah, just a couple. One is about, Nick started out by saying the importance of having humility, which I agree with him, but the problem is that it completely contradicts how we know that organizations work. They work on the basis of electing or appointing people who are super confident to the point of arrogance. And we also know that even now there's some research came out a couple of months ago about narcissism amongst children. And the question in the classroom was, which of the children in your classroom is the most likely to be the best leader and help you solve a problem? And the answer was always the most narcissistic child in the class. Even when the task could not be completed better with a narcissistic child as the leader, they still picked the narcissistic leader. And so there's something in there about this contradiction between, we know we need humility for wicked problems, but actually we don't appoint people who are humble. We appoint people who are super confident, arrogant, and narcissistic. The second point is about the compliance issue, because it's basically your work. And I think the example of Grinch and David Cameron, the lobbying issue at the moment, is precisely this, that his defenses seems to be that he was complying with the regulations, so he's done no wrong. And the point is, what is the purpose of the regulations, not what the regulations are. So I think you're absolutely right, Nick, in that notion of you have to think about the purpose, not the regulation.
Okay, that is great. I would like to just respond to Nick, because I want to put myself in the shoes of an actuary, say 30 to 40 years old, like I was 20, 30 years ago. And everything you say, this panel say makes sense. Context, questioning assumption, navigating, all makes sense, right? But now I'm older, I'm 30 years older, and I sort of realize how important it is. But actually in isolation, what we say is not that earth-changing, a relationship and electing the right leaders. But what we seems to be moving is sort of a fly in a bottle problem. And the reason I'm saying that, because Nick, you quoted the quote from Keith about space between spokes of the wheel. That is a Chinese proverb. The space between the spokes is more important. But how do that actually ask us to go into a space of reflective judgment, right? But reflective judgment and consideration and quietude in listening, right? That in themselves are not radical, but it seems so necessary. And we can't really stage it easily either, because we tend to elect the wrong leaders. Yeah, because we have a fly in the bottle problem in countries as well as in organizations, right? So therefore, how do we jumpstart this? You see. So with that, that is the issue. And Nico, you are right. He made the remark that actuaries should be the arbiter. I think we got to be careful what we say. We would like actuaries to become the arbiters. We cannot claim that we are the arbiters. We would like actuaries to be the arbiters, but that require an increased range of skill sets and toolkit and mindsets, right? Which is yet to be seen as a profession, right? So with that, I'm going to go to the questions, and I think there are even more questions, but I saw two which I'd like to integrate from Radhi as well as from Sam Accord, right? Radhi's assertion is that we need to have an organization, a structure in place, or else how can we solve wicked problems? Or is it possible? So he has immediately identified the importance of boundaries, right? So an organization with an email issue has boundary, but a climate risk issue and hunger in Africa has no boundary. So he asked that question, which I think is linked to what Sam Accord asked, which I'm trying to find Sam Accord's question. But Sam Accord's would be, he said, the collaboration between the three archetypes, individualist, hierarchist, egalitarian, seems to be an essential and core capability. But how does one get this capability into organizations, or for that matter, into a profession at a scale to solve our most wicked problems? Then how do we get this capability, connect societal institutions in this manner? For example, where wicked problems are not to be addressed because stakeholder institutions only represent one or two types. For example, the national health system, the university superannuation scheme, the defined benefit pensions, because it belongs to many different groups. And even within these different groups, there are different archetypes. So how do we marshal this core capability and this phronesis, right? The practical judgment. Nick, you want to have a go, and then after that, Angela, and then Keith.
Yeah, so each of these questions appears to be its own wicked problem. Maybe if I start just by trying sort of combining those together, just to say, well, what are the solutions, and to have a look at, your individual agency. If you're doing work and you're doing this as an exchange of labor, then you've got to understand that the problems presented to you may well be sort of in a tame format, and you need to solve them. If you're asked to do calculations, you need to do the calculations. But then I think you want to look at that is, where is your agency for that? How can you support the changes that sort of both Rathi and Sam are alluding to, in terms of the sort of help the organization forward? And maybe it's step by step rather than radical, but it's moving forward. So one example I would use in investments is that, when we look at an investment problem saying, what's the strategic asset allocation? People might give you a sort of an optimization using Markovits, and that provides a defined solution. The point is that when you have that advice, and if you're up and talking with trustees, is to then say, well, how do you articulate the challenges that are around that? The fact that there's not a single answer for this point, and understanding the wicked dimension. So that is the role that where you have the agency to bring that forward and help colleagues and help that broader understanding with your organization. Say, if you feel it's over-reliant on these single solutions, how do we edge that problem out? And just again, think about your agency and your ability to add the problem. The point about the sort of wickedness is that it's, you know, incremental improvement and adding more dimensions. Think of this, I'll maybe come back to it in a more pluralist way. What are the other viewpoints that you can help bring that to bear? Just to open the crack a little, rather than look to solve it all in the first step.
Yeah, and I think there's something in Keith's work which is about embracing dissent, you know, I've always, throughout my sort of leadership career, I think one of the things that I've always tried to do is to have a really diverse set of people around me, people whose skills complement mine, but also whose views are, you know, completely opposite to mine, and created an environment where I have hierarchical power. You know, at the moment, I have hierarchical power to make decisions, but hopefully people creating an environment where people are happy to question those decisions, and also one where the decisions aren't made forever and a day, that we can come back to them, and it's not a bad thing. So finding a way in your team, and you know, whether it's, you know, your CEO as I am at the moment, or chief actuary, or you're just running a team, making sure that you've always, if you can, get diversity, but more importantly, embrace dissent, embrace that really painful thing. And that, you know, when it happens to you and your team challenge you, it can be really, you know, it's really hard to leave the space for that stuff in your teams, and to find a positive way to manage it. If you practice that skill, even if you practice it within your team will make better decisions. And if your team are making better decisions, then the organisation will be better off. And I think it's a skill that you do need to practice, because your natural instinct when someone, you know, can be to sort of, you know, to argue or say you're right or go through a process. And actually embracing dissent is an underrated skill in organisations in general. It is why we have risk functions, right? There's a construct that's been created in organisations to recognise that dissent is a good thing, but there's a real art to doing it properly. And I think that's something that you can practice as an individual.
Keith, you want to make any remarks, or you want to wait till later?
Just a couple. Just one is on the dissent thing that just follows on from Angela's point. So there's an issue that relates to the structure. So one of my PhD students years ago was an RAF officer, and his PhD was based around the so-called RAF 2020 project, which was, so it's 2010, looking at what the RAF, the Royal Air Force, would look like 10 years on. And to do this, the Chief of the Air Staff decided he would have the top 3 echelons in the RAF to look at this problem. So they normally only worked in their professional silos or their status groups. They never worked together as an egalitarian group. But the project was to try to form them into an egalitarian group to look at this issue, this wicked problem of what 2020 would look like. And so my PhD student's job was to facilitate this. And he said, so for 18 months, once a month, they'd have a dinner with no uniforms, first names only, to weld this egalitarian group together in what is clearly a very strong military hierarchy. And the really interesting thing is that he said this actually worked, but it only worked if the Chief of the Air Staff remained in the room. As long as the Chief of the Air Staff was in the room, they worked as an egalitarian group. Once he left, they went back to their professional silos and their status groups. So this is the clumsy bit, that if you're trying to think about a structural response to a problem, you would normally design a hierarchy or an egalitarian response. But here you've got both, because and this is kind of counterintuitive, but it actually worked given the context that they were happy to work with. So there's something in there about trying to work counterintuitively, that locks into this notion as to how do you engage with dissent, which is a really important point. The other point, which is that scaling problem about, you know, how do you set this up and how do you let it run? And we know that one of the biggest problems is the assumption that you can have a best practice and that solves all your problem. But we know that it doesn't, because there isn't a best practice for wicked problems. That's the point. And the scaling problem is that most of the successful small scale responses are rooted in particular relationships. Once you expand beyond those initial relationships and the trust disappears, then you can't really scale it up. And so there's something in here about trying to recognize in the way that Nick was talking about, you have to start small here and you have to build it, and it take a long time. And it's not as if we're into a 1 or a 2 year project or we can do it by the end of 6 months. This is a building project. It's not an instant response.
I think the other dichotomy, well, I always think that as soon as we get into dichotomies, we tend to go too far down one track, and that becomes a problem. You have to keep switching between different ways of thinking to solve these really tricky problems. But the other important thing for something like climate change, I always say, is, well, we have to start. And so what's the right time to start doing stuff on this, but recognizing that you will go in the wrong direction, and you will have to course correct. You'd have to keep searching for new information, and actually searching for information which it goes against your core kind of assumptions is a really important part of trying to solve some of these things. And how long do you stay? How long do you, taking time to analyze is great. At some point you have to start. When's the right time to start? And once you have started, holding your direction lightly and trying to keep steering and learning. That's something that we don't do well in organizations, right? We've done the analysis, this is the answer, this is what we're doing, now start, go in that direction. I think something like climate change, you could, if you try to get to that level of certainty, you would never start, but you have to start, but then you have to hold it lightly.
Okay, I think we have time for 2 more questions, which I'll tackle Peter Telford and somebody else. But I want to say a few words. Nikki, you can put up also the QR code so that the audience could have a chance to download the SurveyMonkey questionnaire on feedback, so we can get some feedback from you and improve on future series. I wanted to, I like the word embracing dissent, and also then your last few comments on climate change, right? Because implicit, and we are having a conversation here, implicit in Radhi's question and Sam Accott's question is, how do we solve it, is it? How do we solve the problem? Yeah? Because Radhi said that, do we need an organizing structure on boundaries, authority, roles, and leadership structure? Otherwise, how do we solve it? And of course, Sam recognized that this is obviously not that easy. So how do we encourage core capability in uniting the 3 strands of archetypes within organizations and beyond organization? Because climate risk is a beyond organization. It's not just Aviva's task. It's not just Bank of England's task. It's not just Boris Johnson's task. It's everyone's task. Right? How do we go about it? And I couldn't help but think of another Chinese proverb, right, which says that every problem you have, you can have a new set of solution, but every new set of solution will bring you a fresh set of problems. Yeah, which is about, it sort of falls into the dissent part. So you will never have a perfect answer at any point in time, but it's a continuing and evolving journey. And I thought finance in public interest, both John Kay and Paul Collier actually said, if you believe in a narrative, this is an inch by inch fight. No one is going to have the finger or the button to say press and answer is all there, because there's no such elegant solution. If you believe it is our own intervention at the profession, at the institute, and in our own organizations, and you look for entities like that, right? So with that, I want to go to the next question by Peter Telford, and then there's the last question. I'm trying to find I'm trying to find Peter Telford's question. Okay, you just be patient. I just lost it. Just
Is it the question, Chieh, that people don't want to be confused? They'd rather not understand the problem.
That's right. Okay, I got a question. He found that what you said, Keith, on dogmatism and political extremism repel wicked problems, and that is elegant in itself because it's simple but not necessarily effective. But he also asked, is that true of conventional wisdom? J.K. Galbraith, the American economists, have said, right, people actually prefer an anchor in nonsense over a voyage in thought. So people like simple answers and not necessarily the right answers. Keith, would you like to comment on that? Given what has happened in the last 10 years, there's some validity in his question, yeah? And
yeah, no, I think it's a really good question. I think there is something in here about, well, two things. One is to recognize there probably isn't going to be a consensus about any of this stuff. So if you're looking for a consensus, you're never going to get one. And that might be because it contradicts people's material interests, or it just actually undermines their faith in whatever it happens to be. So a consensus is not the right goal. The right goal is to get enough people on board to do something about whatever it is. So running back to the climate change problem, you're never going to get everyone on board here. So what we want is enough people to make a difference, and then hopefully more people will get involved, but you're never going to get everybody involved. I think the other point is really about education, that we know that there is a significant link between people's education and their response to confusion and complex issues. So the more education we have, generally speaking, it is the case that people like that can cope with more complexity because they're better educated. It's not about intelligence, it's about education. So it's that, and that of course is a long-term project. So those two things, the absence of a consensus, the more education, but recognizing that somehow, at some point, you're going to have to make a decision and do stuff rather than wait for everyone to agree or wait to be able to persuade people, because we know that some people are simply not going to be persuaded. You know, the world is full of very large levels of irrationality and non-rationality. So rather than try to persuade people, I think this is one of the points that I would have made had a bit more time. One of the important things is to switch from an answer to a question. It's much harder to answer a difficult question than just respond to an argument. So that one of the real skills is to ask questions that put people in a particular position. And if you're doubly skilled, then you can ask a question with a so-called golden bridge in, which allows somebody to retract from where they are, then even better, because we know that people don't change their minds in public because there's too much face to be lost. So you have to be able to get them to think about, I can lose my face, I can change my mind without losing my face. And that is the way to think about how you get people to change, recognizing that not everybody will always change.
Okay, I think if you could keep our answers succinct, we might be able to squeeze 2 questions, and then I could have a chance to do the close properly and promote our next event. Yeah. The next question comes from Annette Spencer, and her question was, Keith, you talk about tame problems being treated as wicked problems in organizations. Do you think wicked problems can ever become tame if they are addressed appropriately? This for you.
Yeah, so lots of the tame solutions that we now have were once wicked. So if you had, for example, if cholera breaks out in the UK today, we have the taming mechanisms. But if cholera breaks out in somewhere like Gabon in Africa, of course, they don't have the infrastructure. So for them, it would be a continually wicked problem, but for us, it isn't. So there are, most of the things that we have in the tame box were at one point wicked, and we fixed them. Some things continue to be wicked, like bringing a family up, and some things will be fixed. So I think it's probably incorrect to assume that you can't solve wicked problems, because you can, but it depends. And some of them you can't, and some of them you can. You have to be able to slice this up. And sometimes it's just a part of a wicked problem that can be fixed, leaving the other bit for some other generation down the stream. Yeah.
Thank you. Nikki, you can withdraw the QR code slide. And I'm going to ask the last question, and 3 of you could use that question to also sum up, right? It's a question, sum up, and then I'll go to the close, right? Martin White's question, how can we get the right leaders? And this question was prompted by Nick's point about humility, right? So he has a very basic question at every level of society, how can we get the right leaders? So, so maybe Nick, Angela, and then Keith, then I will wrap up.
Yes, another wicked problem. I think basically, if we actually help uncover the challenge, if we can help people understand and create, being more egalitarian by nature, but if we can bring into people's consciousness that there isn't a command. There isn't a tame part of every problem, that these problems are wicked. And then actually, Keith's point that we're not talked that much about is we need to think about reversals. There not being a single solution, that we need to use, not an individual, but collective intelligence. And the fact that actually we need to use our asset of time to actually solve this. So to the point that was earlier, is yes, if people don't understand all the complexity, they get themselves tied in knots and not acting. It's one of the reasons I called myself Gordian, is you just need to cut through the knot to find some solutions and accept, as Angela was saying, that we don't know all the answers. We're going to start stepping our way forward, seeing where our torchlight leads us to, but actually and understanding we have the asset of time over that to actually evolve medicine. It's so critical in sustainability. To Martin's point, is I think that what we can do, the only thing we can do collectively is help actually uncover these things that do not have complete solutions, and then encourage this type of servant leadership that actually embraces this and thinks about the problem to solve. At least straight off the bat, that's the best answer that I can offer in my humility.
Okay, Angela and Keith, I could ask you to be succinct because we got to observe the time. Yeah, Angela.
Yeah, well, I think this is also this question is a wicked problem, right? How do you political leadership in organisations doesn't necessarily lend itself to this. So I always start with the what can you do. So some of you will be the leaders of the future if you understand this, if you cultivate this conversation in your organisation, if you search for dissent, if you do all of those things, you will be better at your job. You will get better outcomes. That will mean you are more likely to be promoted, and over time, maybe that will mean there are more people who understand this in the hierarchies. So a step towards it by everything that you do as an individual.
Keith. Last
yeah, two quick things. One is to stop confusing confidence for competence and trying to find a measure between those two, because they're very different kinds of things. And the second thing is to think about embedding failure in the assessment. So we did a paper with some colleagues on failure in US Navy SEALs, and what they look for in assessing US Navy SEALs is not whether they fail or not, but what happens when they do fail, because failure is built into the system. So they're interested in, when you fail, what will you do? Not whether you fail or not.
I have a more practical answer, a more immediate answer. Listen to yourself and influence wisely, and vote in the next council elections, which are coming out in the next 2 months. Okay, with that, I'm going to go to the close. So thanks very much, Keith, for this. For setting it up for us. It was truly an engaging and interesting conversation, and I thank Angela and Nick for their partnership as well. The next event is actually a whole fortnight series of events, right? In my view, a very impressive range of events. COVID-19, actual innovation in the COVID-19 era, and we have some really fantastic speakers and presentations, right, from our own community, as well as household names from outside the profession, like Sir David Spiegelhalter, Dame Sally Davies, the former Chief Medical Officer for England, as well as Sir Ian Diamond, the National Statistician. And of course, amongst ourselves, we have Actuary by the Day, Stuart McDonald, and a whole range of many other speakers. Yeah, so do sign up to as many sessions as you can. It promises to be a fantastic couple of weeks. Following that, the Presidential Speaker Series returns on the 18th of May with Professor Sir Adrian Smith, who is currently the CEO of the Alan Turing Institute and the President of the Royal Society. And Sir Adrian will share his views on the work of the Royal Society, as well as on mathematical futures and how he sees the actual profession in it. So that concludes today's event. Thank you very much for joining us, and goodbye. Thank you, guys.